The word Mediterranean is derived from Latin and means in the middle of the earth, a reference either to the fact that the Mediterranean Sea is almost entirely surrounded by land, or that it was deemed to be at the center of the known world by ancient Afro-Eurasian geographers. Certainly the Mediterranean was central to life in some of the world's most ancient civilizations and to the trade in goods that linked those civilizations to one another. But 5.5 million years ago, the Mediterranean basin was an almost completely dry expanse of land lying at elevations of between 1 to 2 miles below sea level. The basin had been formed by the collision between the African and Eurasian plates in the early Jurassic period, and it was completely sealed off from the Atlantic Ocean by a ridge of high mountains that connected Spain and Morocco, ancient mountains that essentially joined Europe with Africa. Then, around 5.3 million years ago, a tectonic subsidence in the seafloor caused the mountain range to collapse, and water from the Atlantic began to pour through the breach. It quickly became a catastrophic flood, discharging 100 million cubic meters of Atlantic water per second down the slopes into the low-lying Mediterranean basin at speeds of about 100 kilometers per hour, leaving scars on the seabed that are still visible today. This Zanclean flood, as it is known to geologists, tore open a great gash in the earth that became the Straits of Gibraltar, and in less than 2 years it created the Mediterranean Sea, which today contains about 4 million cubic kilometers of water. So the Mediterranean was no longer landlocked. It was and is connected by the narrow Straits of Gibraltar to the Atlantic Ocean in the west, and by the even narrower Hellespont and Dardanelles waterways to the Black Sea in the east. The coastline of this sea in the middle of the earth is almost 29,000 miles long, and it is upon this extensive littoral that a range of human communities found themselves at various times incorporated into extensive agrarian civilizations, but at other times enjoying their independence. In this lecture, we explore 4 such smaller cultures of the ancient Mediterranean, whose influence on subsequent history has been surprisingly profound given their relative lack of political power. None of them was a military match for the great imperial civilizations we have been discussing, the Egyptians or the Hittites, for example. But each of them was destined to leave their mark on the Mediterranean and indeed the wider world for different reasons. And none of them, it can safely be said, would have existed or developed as they did had it not been for the chance creation of the Mediterranean itself. Let's pick up the story around the year 1200 before the Common Era, when both the Hittite kingdom in Mesopotamia and the New Kingdom in Egypt had entered a period of decline, allowing for smaller groups to assert their independence. Significant amongst these were the Semitic-speaking Phoenicians, descendants of Canaanite peoples that had dwelt along the shores of the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. Their ancestors probably migrated out of the Arabian Peninsula to the coast around 3000 BCE. Once resettled, they organized themselves into a confederation of independent city-states along the coast of modern Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. Many of their settlements have persisted to the present day, including Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut, and these larger cities had considerable influence over smaller settlements, particularly Tyre, which by the 10th century BCE dominated much of southern Phoenicia. The Phoenicians were always more interested in trade than empire building, however, so that even the largest Phoenician city-states often found themselves political subjects of larger regional powers. Yet despite not ever being particularly numerous or powerful, Phoenician influence on the Mediterranean basin was strong because of their well-developed trade networks and their supreme skill as shipbuilders and mariners. Phoenicians also traded overland with Mesopotamia, and they provided much of the cedar, furnishings, and decorative items for the Israelites' temple in Jerusalem. But it is as superb maritime traders that the Phoenicians earned their reputation, specializing in the export of high-quality metal goods, of pottery, glass, art, and richly dyed textiles. To facilitate trade, the Phoenicians established a series of commercial colonies and mines in Spain and North Africa. One colony in what is today Tunisia grew into the capital of a major power that would challenge Rome for control of the entire Mediterranean basin, the city of Carthage. The Phoenicians were renowned for their brilliant red and purple dyes, which were exported all over the Mediterranean. The magnificent violet-purple Tyrian dye came from the Murex sea snail, once common in the Eastern Mediterranean, but now largely extinct. The Murex is a carnivorous mollusk that first appears in the fossil record around 125 million years ago before expanding all over the world. The Phoenicians realized that by extracting the mucus from the glands of two particular Murex species, they could manufacture a rich purple dye that quickly found use in ceremonial robes for high-ranking officials. Indeed, purple came to be the color of the imperial classes of Rome, of Egypt, and Persia, and remained a royal color through the medieval period and even in Elizabethan England. Another extraordinary fact about the Murex is that no less a scientist than the ancient Greek Aristotle used the term Murex when describing this species in the 4th century BCE, which makes it one of the oldest classification names still in use in the scientific community today. As successful as they were as traders, the Phoenicians had an even greater influence on subsequent world history because of the alphabetic writing system they devised. Adapting Egyptian hieroglyphs through a series of experiments, Phoenician scribes eventually devised an alphabetic system consisting of 22 letters, each one a consonant. Consider what a remarkable example of intercivilizational collective learning that is. Now, having to learn just 22 letters and build words from them was obviously considerably easier than memorizing hundreds of cuneiform symbols of the kind used by the Sumerians, and it was also much more flexible than putting together the symbols the Egyptians had devised through their hieroglyphic system. The Phoenician alphabet was also more intuitive in that it was phonetic. The fact that each symbol represented a specific sound added to the popularity of the alphabet as it spread across the region with Phoenician traders. Because the script was relatively easy to learn and the spread of the alphabet increased literacy levels throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, and writing ceased to become something that only people of high status could master, helping to undermine class divisions in states that adopted the system. Much later, the classical Greeks also adopted the Phoenician alphabet, and by adding vowel sounds to the consonants, they made it even more flexible. The Greek version of the phonetic alphabet went on to influence the Romans and is also the basis of the Cyrillic alphabet. So the system worked out by Phoenician scribes 3,000 years ago remains deeply entrenched today as the basis for modern alphabets that are used all around the world. Before we leave the Phoenicians, it's worth considering a broader historical development to which they contributed, one that continued into the early modern era, namely the dynamism of small commercial states. The Phoenicians established a series of purely commercial city-states that was similar in nature to the subsequent ancient Greek polis, and also much later to the great trading cities of the Indian Ocean, even the Italian city-states of the early modern era. Because they were focused primarily on trade as opposed to tribute taking, all of these commercial city-states tended to be more technologically innovative than the huge tributary empires. They also tended to engage more actively with trans-regional exchange networks because of their own limited internal resources and highly urbanized commercial populations. Eventually, as we will see, many of these geographically small states with limited resources became politically and militarily powerful enough to challenge and even defeat the vast tributary civilizations, with profound ramifications for the modern world. Another example of a small, militarily inconsequential society that was nonetheless destined to play a major role in world history is that of the Hebrews. Despite being minor players in the history of the ancient world, the Hebrews laid the foundations for three of the great world religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The only source for much of the history of the Hebrews is what Jews call the Tanakh, essentially the Old Testament of the Judeo-Christian Bible, and this makes it difficult to provide a definitive chronology for their political history. The term Hebrew refers to all who were speakers of ancient Hebrew, a Semitic language related to that spoken by the Canaanites, the ancestors of the Phoenicians. The ancestors of the Hebrews were probably pastoral nomads who inhabited lands between Mesopotamia and Egypt during the 3rd millennium BCE. As Mesopotamian civilization prospered, some Hebrews settled in the great cities of the region. We read in the Old Testament, for example, that the Hebrew patriarch Abraham, who would come to play a crucial role in both Christian and Islamic tradition, lived in the Sumerian city of Ur. But sometime around 1900 BCE, it is believed, Abraham led his family and others out of Ur westwards to the land of Canaan or Palestine. As they migrated, the Hebrews appear to have taken with them a number of elements of Sumerian culture, including Hammurabi's law codes and many of the fascinating stories from the Epic of Gilgamesh, such as the legend of a great flood. These elements can be found woven into the Old Testament itself. According to the Old Testament, Abraham and his family did not remain in Palestine, but migrated south into Egypt with many other Hebrews until they were eventually forced to depart again in an exodus under the leadership of Moses and return to Palestine. Efforts to date this exodus by biblical scholars have been inconclusive, although the reign of Ramesses II, which lasted from about 1279 to 1215 BCE, is promoted as the possible historical context. As of now, no evidence has been discovered of large numbers of Hebrews living in Egypt, either as free citizens or slaves, nor of Moses, who was said to have led his people back to Palestine. Archaeological evidence does show an eventual Hebrew occupation of Palestine, but it appears to have been a slow process in which the Canaanite residents of the region simply absorbed the Hebrews over a long period of time, rather than the military conquest depicted in the Old Testament. The Hebrew branch that settled in Canaan is known as the Israelites. They abandoned the earlier Hebrew tribal structure and adopted a Mesopotamian-style monarchy with power in the hands of male kings. Bitter conflicts were ongoing with other residents of the region, particularly the powerful Philistines, who in one campaign captured the sacred Israelite Ark of the Covenant. The Ark was a wooden chest decorated with gold that was said to contain the 2 stone tablets of the 10 Commandments and other sacred objects. Biblical accounts describe 3 powerful Israelite kings, although archaeology has not provided much supporting evidence for their reigns. The first king was Saul. His successor David slew the Philistine giant Goliath and recovered the Ark, and David's successor was the famous King Solomon. According to the Old Testament, Solomon had a huge palace constructed and maintained a large army based in the cosmopolitan city of Jerusalem. He ruled for 4 decades between 961 and 922 BCE, and during his reign, Israel reached the peak of its power. The texts go on to note that after the reign of David, tribal tensions amongst the Israelites resulted in the kingdom of Israel splitting in 2 weaker states, the southern of which was called Judah, from whence the term Jews is derived. While internal divisions and conflicts with other peoples always limited the Hebrews' political and military power, their increasingly distinctive religious beliefs came to have tremendous historical influence. The early Hebrews living in the cities of Samaria had venerated many of the Mesopotamian gods, but as befits a people of pastoral nomadic background, they also believed that nature spirits dwelt in trees, rocks, and mountains. Yet Abraham and later Moses, who was said to have led the Exodus out of Egypt, explicitly embraced monotheism. They believed there was only one God called Yahweh, who was a supremely powerful deity and the creator of the world. And so when the kings of the Israelites established their own kingdom in Jerusalem, they did not build a Mesopotamian ziggurat, but a temple in honor of Yahweh. As well as being the omnipotent creator of the universe, Yahweh was also a very personal God with high moral and ethical standards expected of his followers. In conveying these standards to his people in the 10 Commandments, Moses warned against antisocial behavior like lying, theft, adultery, and murder. After Moses' death, this original set of commandments evolved into a detailed and elaborate law code that provided protection for widows, orphans, slaves, and the poor. Between roughly 1400 BCE, the Israelite religious leaders compiled a set of holy scriptures known as the Torah, or the teachings, which laid out Yahweh's laws and role in the affairs of mankind, as well as an account of the history of their people. The Torah taught that Yahweh would punish not only individuals, but indeed entire communities if they did not obey his laws. In 722 BCE, Assyrian forces conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, capturing 27,290 Israelite slaves and deporting them to other regions within the Assyrian Empire. Since their arrival on the scene around 1300 BCE, the Assyrians had used their powerful and intimidating army to extend their authority throughout Mesopotamia until by 670 they were masters of much of Western Asia. But Assyrian domination was extremely unpopular, and rulers were continuously faced with rebellions by subjects in various parts of an empire that was simply too large for them to administer effectively. Assyrian power began to wane in the 7th century BCE, and by 612, the Assyrian capital of Nineveh had been destroyed by new powers in the region. A second calamitous scattering of Israelites occurred soon after these events, when in 586 BCE, the southern kingdom of Judah was captured by the powerful king of the Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar, who also sent thousands of Jewish captives into exile. But the Babylonians were destined to be superseded by the Persians, and the founder of the Persian Empire, King Cyrus, allowed some Jewish captives to return home, although most of the Jews remained dispersed all over Western Asia and the Mediterranean basin. This dispersion, a product of the invasion of Palestine by two powerful imperial armies, has been referred to ever since as the diaspora, the Greek word for scattering. In conjunction with these disasters, a series of prophets emerged who criticized the corruption of Israelite society and the people's declining commitment to the important principles of its faith. They warned that unless the Israelites changed their ways, Yahweh would punish them by sending conquerors, and the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests were held up as proof that these warnings were to be heeded. Those exiles who decided to return home after being liberated by Cyrus organized themselves into several small Jewish states, which now functioned as enclaves within the great empires that came to dominate Southwest Asia from the 6th century BCE onwards. Yet even in the midst of the Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman empires, these small Jewish states were able to maintain their distinctive religious and cultural identity based on their perceived special relationship with Yahweh and the teachings of the Torah. And that was how their beliefs survived to have such a substantial influence on the world, both in themselves and through Christianity and Islam. It's an early example of the power of human ideas and beliefs, which can pass from one civilization to another, far outlasting the lives of individuals and the lifespan of any political or military power. To the west of Israel, on the islands and mainland of the Aegean Sea, another group of mariners were carving out their own cultural space in the region, even before Abraham is thought to have led his family out of Mesopotamia. These were the Minoans, so named after their legendary king Minos, and they established themselves on the island of Crete before gradually spreading to other islands in the Aegean, along the coast of ancient Turkey and mainland Greece. Minoan culture was influenced by trade with Egypt and West Asia, facilitated by the central location of Crete. For 750 years, between 2200 and 1450, Crete was a major center of Mediterranean commerce. Minoan merchants used advanced sailing craft of Phoenician design to become actively engaged in long-range trade all across the Mediterranean. The prized exports of the Minoans were olive oil, wine, wool, and pottery, which they exchanged for grains, textiles, and various manufactured goods. Archaeologists have discovered pottery vessels used as storage containers for Minoan wine and olive oil as far west as Sicily, and by 1600 BCE, the Minoans had established colonies on Cyprus and many islands in the Aegean Sea, probably to mine copper ores and gain better access to markets where tin was available. In so doing, the Minoans, like the Phoenicians, established a precedent for extensive colonization that would become an important aspect of classical Greek culture. The Minoan state was governed by rulers who used both Egyptian hieroglyphics and also a script known as Linear A to keep records. But unfortunately, Linear A has never been deciphered. Historians have long characterized the Minoan political structure as monarchical, but more recently scholars have started to question whether there really was ever a single male king of the Minoans. Indeed, although fresco evidence seems to suggest that certain groups or even individuals might have occupied positions of leadership for specific tasks perhaps, there remains almost no other evidence of powerful elites or hierarchies within Minoan society. Much of our knowledge of their politics and culture comes from archaeology, particularly the discovery of what may have been a palace at Knossos by British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans in 1900, just one of a series of lavish facilities constructed across the island between 2000 and 1700 BCE. The Knossos structure was built of brick, was 3 stories high and a massive 6 acres in area, and had running water and sanitation that was only bettered by the Romans 1,000 years later. Knossos is particularly remarkable for the rich wall frescoes depicting the Minoans as a happy and peaceful people who enjoyed dancing and athletics, including performing somersaults over the backs of bulls. Elite Minoan women also appear to have enjoyed relative freedom and equality, another interesting example of an ancient civilization with attitudes towards gender that seem surprisingly ahead of their time. Far from being confined to their homes, the frescoes depict them playing roles at least equal to those of men at public events, such as athletic games and religious festivals. Their elaborately patterned dresses, often open to the waist to reveal their breasts, and their beautifully curled and arranged long dark hair suggest that these were women with the time, resources, and social freedom to follow high fashion. The fact that both men and women are depicted participating equally in sports like bull jumping has led some historians to argue for gender equality in Minoan society, even for some type of matrilineal inheritance. Minoan religion also appears to have been focused on female divinities, and women played the lead role as officials at religious ceremonies. The principal deity was a beautiful mother goddess who was usually dressed in the most fashionable of clothing that sometimes included a strapless fitted bodice, the first form-fitted garment known to history. It seems probable that the Minoan mother goddess was the inspiration for later goddesses of classical Greek religion, including Athena, Demeter, and Aphrodite. As we will see, something similar happened with fertility divinities in the Indus civilization, which appear to have been the prototypes for subsequent Hindu goddesses. After 1700 BCE, Minoan society experienced a series of natural disasters as plate tectonic movements under the Mediterranean Sea triggered earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The most destructive of these was an enormous eruption on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, north of Crete, in 1628, which caused a massive tsunami to sweep south from Thera to devastate the great complex at Knossos. Thera had erupted numerous times before this, but the 1628 eruption was on an entirely new scale again, ejecting 4 times as much material as the famous Krakatoa eruption of 1883. This was one of the top 3 volcanic eruptions in all recorded history. Now, the Minoans did rebuild their palaces to include the latest technology, including the world's first flush toilets. But after 1450, the wealth of their civilization attracted a series of invaders. By 1100, Crete had fallen under foreign control, yet Minoan maritime skill, colonization, and building traditions went on to profoundly influence the inhabitants of nearby mainland Greece, including new groups of Indo-European speaking nomads who had settled there during the previous millennium. These migrants mingled with earlier farming cultures and settled in fortified citadels at places like Athens and Mycenae, from which this new culture derives its name, the Mycenaeans. Although they were influenced by Minoan culture, the Mycenaeans were essentially militarized sea raiders. They built massive stone fortresses throughout the southern parts of the Greek peninsula, fortresses that offered protection and thus attracted settlers who built agricultural settlements around them. Most of the Mycenaean population were tenant farmers who lived in villages, but recognized the masters of the fortresses as their leaders, a militarized nobility that was in turn under the control of a king who lived in a nearby palace. We have good evidence of the social structures of Mycenaean culture from excavations at the site of Pylos on Greece's Peloponnese. The king, who possessed large estates and may have been seen as semi-divine, appointed individuals to powerful administrative positions and was supported by administrative officials known as the Hekwati, or followers. Below the noble and administrative classes were labourers who worked in groups of 18 men and 8 boys in agriculture or in textile or metal production. Trade in textiles, metals and other goods was a vital component of Mycenaean society. Yet in all the artefacts discovered, there's no evidence of a merchant class, suggesting that the elites probably used their monopoly control of trade to further strengthen their power and their wealth. After they became aware of Minoan culture, Mycenaean women adopted some elements of Minoan fashion and added their own decorative touches with cosmetics and jewellery. But Mycenaean society was decidedly more patriarchal than Minoan. Both upper and lower class women are depicted performing a range of domestic tasks: laundry, grinding grain, and bathing and anointing male warriors, for example. The wealth that Mycenaean society accumulated is seen in gold, silver, and ivory artifacts discovered in the royal palace of Mycenae by German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann in 1876. The palace had large audience rooms, apartments, frescoes on the walls, and huge beehive tombs. The Mycenaeans adopted a form of Minoan Linear A writing, but they developed it further into a syllabic script known as Linear B, essentially an early form of Greek, which was deciphered in 1952 by the brilliant English philologist Michael Ventris. The Mycenaeans also adopted the Minoan practice of colonization and established commercial settlements in Turkey, Sicily, and southern Italy. Perhaps to eliminate a commercial rival, in about 1250 BCE, the Mycenaeans launched a hostile expedition to the city of Troy on the coast of modern Turkey. Troy occupied a strategic location on the Hellespont Strait, which connects the Black Sea and the Aegean, and from here the Trojans controlled major sea and land trade routes. In the early 19th century, most historians believed Troy to be a mythical city invented by the Greek poet Homer. But Heinrich Schliemann, filled as a little boy with the tales of the great heroes of Homer's Iliad, believed it to be real. He excavated Troy and eventually found 9 buried cities, one on top of the other. The cause that Homer gave for the war was the abduction of Helen, Queen of Sparta, by the Trojan prince Paris. The city was besieged by the inhabitants of Greece for 10 years before finally falling to them through the ruse of the wooden horse. We have no way of knowing how much of that is true, but the Trojan War, whatever its real details, was in fact part of a much broader period of chaos in the region, and it coincided with invasions of the Mycenaean homeland by foreign mariners wielding iron weapons. The identity of these invaders remains a mystery to this day. As we saw in an earlier lecture, between 1150 and 800 BCE, a period sometimes termed the Greek Dark Ages, chaos reigned throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. This turbulence may have been related to the climate change and migrations that roiled Southwest Asia starting in 1200 BCE. Invasions and civil unrest made it impossible to maintain stable government or productive agriculture. Mycenaean palaces fell into ruin and population declined sharply as settlements were abandoned, and both Linear A and B writing disappeared. Homer depicts a society riven with conflict. The king's role was now that of a war leader who maintained his status by being first among equals in military prowess. Society was dominated by an elite military class, although the commoners may have enjoyed some rights through a common assembly. Tensions between nobles and commoners were destined to dominate the next several centuries as the prevailing social structure was constantly called into question. But in the wake of social conflict and military chaos, new civilization eventually emerged in the Eastern Mediterranean, Hellenic civilization, so named for a mythological king who was said to be descended from the gods and to be the ancestor of all Greeks. Greece has been known as Hellas since ancient times, and its innovations in philosophy, the sciences, the arts, and government continue to exert a powerful influence on the world today. But we need to remember that many of those innovations were grounded in the achievements of the Phoenicians, the Hebrews, the Minoans, and the Mycenaeans, small but immensely influential players in history.